move on to the GI tab. GI is basically Global Illumination. This controls the lighting in your scene. I like to enable Global Illumination because I feel like it gives me a more realistic effect. I use the irradiance map for my primary bounces and the light cache for my secondary bounces. Remember that if you choose CUDA as your production render engine, you are stuck using brute force as your primary bounces and will therefore be logged out of the following settings, including ambient occlusion. Under GI Advanced, enable ambient occlusion. If you have played a lot of games, this will seem familiar to you. Ambient occlusion deals with indirect shading of objects in a scene. It creates soft shadows between objects that are in close proximity to each other and adds much needed depth to your renders. Basically, it makes your renders look more realistic. Let's create a scene where we'll be able to clearly visualize the effect of ambient occlusion. Create a cube from the Poly Modeling tab. Right-click, hold and drag the cursor to face to enable face selection. Select a cube face and delete it so we have light coming through that opening. Head over to the Vray tab and create a dome light. Enable Use Dome Texture so we can assign an HDR image to the dome light. This allows us to simulate the diffuse environmental lighting with realistic reflections. You can find many HDR images at some specific sites. I'll link those sites down below as well as the HDR file I used for this scene. Let's render it out. We see that our image has much softer and realistic looking lighting. It also takes considerably longer to render since much more of the scene is visible. Let's go back to the Common tab and enable resumable rendering. I'm going to restart the render. You'll notice that Vray now does 4 pre-passes before rendering the image. These are because of the irradiance map and light cache settings. Reducing the quality of the irradiance map reduces the number of pre-passes. Anyway, after the pre-passes are done, I'm going to stop the render. And when we restart it again, we see that the render resumes from where it left off. This setting can help when, for whatever reason, you need to stop the rendering. You can start off where you left instead of rendering the whole image again. But remember, you need to enable the setting before you start rendering. Otherwise, it will not work. I advise you to use it mainly for final renders. Disable resumable rendering because we won't be using it for now, and click on render. Wait for the image to render. Click on the icon with the red square to enable region render. This helps you to render just a part of your image to save time. Let's head back to the GI tab and enable ambient occlusion. Click on the cube, go to mesh display and reverse the faces. Click on render and we see that there are some soft shadows appearing in the corners of the cube, although they're a bit noisy at the moment. Now I'm going to show you a little trick I use to spot the little differences in my renders. Go to the bottom of the Vray frame buffer and click on the H icon. This opens up the history panel. I'm going to hit X to clear my history from a project I was working on before. Okay, so let's hit render and render out the region with ambient occlusion enabled. Hit this icon to save that in the history. Disable ambient occlusion, hit render again. Save the second image. Click on the first image and hit A to set the first image as A. Click on the second image and this time set it as B. Click on the comparison icon which brings up a line which separates either image on the frame buffer. Dragging the line across shows the differences between occlusion on and occlusion off. Let's clear the images, turn off the history panel and hide it by clicking the H icon again. Let's turn the ambient occlusion on again. Under the irradiance map, set the quality to medium. I find that medium is a perfect balance between time and quality. You can decide to go for high if you have a more powerful rig, but medium works just fine for me. I use the very low setting only for test renders to speed up the process. Under Irradiance Map Advanced, enable Enhanced Details. Under Light Cache, you have subdivisions and sample size. I normally leave the sample size at default, but for the subdivisions, the value depends on your resolution. The general rule is to multiply the width and height pixels of your resolution and find the square root of that value. For example, if our preset is 540 HD, our width and height values are 960p and 540p respectively. If we multiply that, we get 518,400. Square root of that is 720. And no, I did not just pause to get a calculator. Head over to the settings tab. On the system, we have the dynamic memory setting, which allows you to specify in megabytes how much RAM you want Vray to use during rendering. You can choose any value you want depending on your needs, but setting it to 0 means Vray will use all RAM available on your rig when needed. That's the option I always choose because why not? You can also decide to conserve memory if you want to multitask while rendering. Under System Advanced, you can specify the number of CPU threads you want Vray to use to render your image. Remember that the number of CPU threads equals the number of buckets Vray will use in a render. Setting it to 0 will of course tell Vray to use all available threads, which I recommend for faster renders. But if you're multitasking, you can set this to a number where you have at most 2 cores free for other tasks and enable low thread priority so your CPU can divert some of its focus to those other tasks. If for some reason you don't know how much RAM or how many threads you have, then follow these steps if you're on Windows. Hold down the Windows key plus R on the keyboard. In the dialog box that appears, type dxdiag and press OK. If another box pops up, hit OK again until you see this dialog box. Under memory, you'll find the amount of RAM you have in megabytes. Divide by approximately 1000 to get the gigabytes value. Mine is 32 gigs. Under processor, it says 12 CPUs, which means I have 12 threads. If you're on a Mac, well, God help you. And if you're on a Linux, chances are you already know your specs, so you don't need this tutorial. In the Render Elements tab, you can add more passes for use in post-processing. Let's render out our image first. Enable our history panel, save our first image, add a denoiser, and an extra text pass. The denoiser helps you clear out the noise after the final render is done. This is much faster than setting very high subdivision values or very low threshold values in the DMC sampler. And that's why I told you I normally leave those values at default, because I normally render out a denoiser pass. But be careful with this tool, because it tends to register very small details as noise and consequently smooth them out. I normally leave it at the default, but when I have very fine details, I use the mount preset. You can set it to custom to input your own values. The extra text pass allows you to visualize your ambient occlusion effect and render it out as a pass. Click on the checker beside the texture box and select Vray Det from the pop-up. Make sure Ignore for GI is checked, and now the pass will render out whatever settings you specify in your GI tab. Render the image out. You can see on the beauty render there's still a lot of noise. But if we come up here and switch to the effects results channel, we can see that there's no noise because the denoiser has been applied to the effects result channel. If we switch to the extra text channel, we can see the ambient occlusion effect clearly. Note that if you want to render out this pass, you can also apply a denoiser to it in the attributes editor. Let's switch back to the beauty render. Click the first icon at the bottom of the frame buffer to access the effects panel. Here you can control your exposure settings, your white balance, your curves and levels. Basically, all of the things you do in post-processing. You can even change the background image. Let's go to panels and change the render cam back to perspective. When we hit the render icon on the frame buffer, Vray starts rendering the last scene rendered and not the current scene. But if we hit the main render icon in Maya, it renders the current scene. So I know this has been a lot to take in. Feel free to rewind to the bits you don't understand and pause whenever you feel that I'm going too fast. If you feel I've mentioned something you haven't heard before, consider watching my previous videos as I touched on the basics of Maya in those. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did. And if you have any suggestions or questions, please let me know in the comments. See you in the next video, or not. Your choice. Or is it really?